When magic fails and your world shatters, salvation emerges from the shadows. Can hatred turn to heat when your only support is an enemy? A story of healing where it's not just bones that break, written especially for you. The silence in the flat was not peaceful. It was heavy, medicinal, and tasted of failed expectations. Hermione Granger sat on her velvet sofa, her left leg encased in a heavy, archaic cast that hummed with the dull, frustrated resonance of stalled magic. A freak accident in the Department of Mysteries, a collapsing shelf of Time Turner prototypes, hadn't just snapped the bone. It had starved the area of magical receptivity. Scalar Grow had tasted like chalky betrayal, sliding down her throat and doing absolutely nothing. The healers at St. Mungo's had been apologetic but firm. The bone had to knit the Muggle way. 6 weeks of stillness, 6 weeks of working from home. She looked at the mountain of parchment on her coffee table and felt a surge of pure, unadulterated bile. It wasn't the work she hated. It was the delivery system. The flue flared a sharp, haughty green. Hermione stiffened, her fingers digging into the upholstery. She didn't look up as the tall, lean silhouette stepped out, dusting soot from a coat that cost more than her entire living room suite. "I believe this is the section on the Centaur Liaison Decree," a cold, drawling voice announced. Draco Malfoy didn't step further into the room. He stood by the hearth, holding a thick bundle of documents like it was a contaminated sample. His silver-blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, his expression one of bored, aristocratic endurance. "Put it with the others, Malfoy," Hermione said, her voice tight. She hated how weak she sounded, pinned beneath a blanket with her leg propped up on a pile of cushions. "And the transcripts from yesterday. I assume you've managed to transcribe them without adding your own biased commentary." Draco's eyes flickered to her, sharp and calculating. "I am a high-level consultant, Granger, not your personal secretary. The fact that the Ministry has suggested I facilitate your recovery is a stain on my schedule that I am currently enduring with remarkable grace." "Grace?" Hermione let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "You look like you're waiting for a port key to take you anywhere else. If you hate being here so much, leave the files and go. I'm sure I can find a way to drag myself to the fireplace if I need anything else." She made a move to sit up, a reckless, stubborn shift that sent a white-hot spike of pain through her hip. She gasped, her face draining of colour, and her hand flew to her leg. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. Draco took a step forward, his hand twitching as if to reach out. The coldness in his eyes wavered, replaced by something visceral, a flicker of genuine alarm. The air between them suddenly felt charged, the distance closing in a way that made her heart hammer against her ribs. But as quickly as the warmth appeared, he recoiled. He saw her eyes on him, saw the vulnerability she was trying to hide, and he snapped back into his armor. He dropped the files onto the table with a loud, dismissive thud that made her jump. "Don't be pathetic," he snapped, his voice even colder than before. "If you fall and break the other one, Kingsley will probably have me arrested for negligence. Sit still. I'm not here to watch you play the martyr." "I am not playing anything," she hissed, her eyes stinging with frustrated tears she refused to shed. "I am trapped in this house, Malfoy. My brain is moving at 100 miles an hour, and my body is a cage. You wouldn't understand. You've never had to work for anything in your life, let alone struggle for it." Draco's jaw tightened. He looked around the small, cluttered flat. The overflow in bookshelves, the half-empty teacups, the general chaos of a mind that couldn't stop even when the legs did. A sneer curled his lip, but it felt practiced, almost hollow. "You think this is a struggle?" he asked softly, leaning over her. He was close enough now that she could smell his cologne, sandalwood and something sharp, like ozone. Being pampered on a sofa while the world waits on you. Some would call that a vacation. I call it a nuisance. He turned on his heel, heading back to the flue. "Malfoy," she called out, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and something she couldn't name. He paused, his hand on the mantel. "The cat needs feeding," she whispered, the admission of her helplessness tasting like ash. "The tin is in the kitchen. I can't reach the high shelf today." Draco froze. The silence stretched, long and agonizing. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Hermione waited for the mocking comment, the sharp jab about her being a crazy cat lady, or his refusal to do servant's work. Instead, he let out a long, weary sigh. Without a word, he turned away from the fire and walked toward the kitchen. Hermione listened, her heart racing. She heard the click of the cupboard, the slide of the tin, and the soft clink of a fork against a ceramic bowl. It was a domestic sound, so utterly at odds with the man in the three-piece suit. Crookshanks, usually a creature of immense suspicion, didn't growl. In fact, Hermione heard a faint, traitorous purr. When Draco emerged, he didn't look at her. He walked straight to the flue, grabbed a handful of powder, and stepped into the flames. "Eat your soup, Granger," he said, his voice flat. "It's on the counter. I moved it to a lower shelf. Try not to set the building on fire before tomorrow." The green flames engulfed him, leaving Hermione alone in the sudden, ringing silence. She looked at the documents he'd brought, neatly organized, perfectly labeled. She looked toward the kitchen, where a bowl of food was waiting for her cat, and a pot of soup had been moved within her reach. She felt a strange, dizzying sensation in her chest, a seesaw of emotion. He was a prat. He was arrogant. He was the man who had spent years making her feel inferior. And yet, the soup was warm, and the cat was fed. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, the cold of his departure lingering longer than it should have. The conflict wasn't just in the room. It was starting to take root in her mind. Tomorrow, he would come back. Tomorrow, the green flames would bring the man she hated, and she realized with a jolt of terror that she was already counting the hours until the hearth turned green again. The internal monologue of her pride fought against the reality of her isolation. "He's only doing it because he's forced to," she told herself. "He wants to be anywhere else." But as she watched Crookshanks lick his paws with contentment, the doubt began to seep in. Why move the soup? Why stay those extra 30 seconds? She picked up a quill, her hand shaking slightly. The first part of the decree stared back at her, but the words blurred. All she could see was the way his hand had twitched toward her when she gasped in pain. A ghost of a movement that suggested the ice in Draco Malfoy's veins might be starting to thaw, whether he wanted it to or not. The struggle was no longer just about a broken bone. It was about the slow, agonizing break in the walls she had built to keep the world out. and the walls he had built to keep himself in. And as the rain began to lash against the windows of her London flat, Hermione Granger realized that this was going to be a very long 6 weeks. The second week of Hermione's confinement began with a thunderstorm that rattled the window panes of her flat, a physical manifestation of the tempest brewing behind her ribs. The novelty of the injury, if there ever was any, had curdled into a thick, stagnant frustration. Every muscle in her body ached from the unnatural distribution of weight, and her mind felt like a library where the books were being slowly soaked in water. When the flue flared green at precisely 9 o'clock, she didn't even look up from her notes. She was determined to remain an island of professional indifference. "You're late," she said, her voice clipped. The briefing for the Wizengamot subcommittee was due 10 minutes ago. Draco stepped out, but he wasn't carrying the usual leather satchel. Instead, he was balancing a tray from a nearby wizarding cafe and a stack of heavy iron-bound ledgers. He looked windswept, a stray lock of blonde hair falling over his forehead, ruining his usual calculated perfection. "The Flue network is backed up because of the storm, Granger. Even the Ministry's golden girl should understand the basic principles of magical congestion," he retorted, though the bite in his voice lacked its usual venom. He set the tray down on the coffee table, pushing her meticulously organized quills aside. "What is this?" she asked, eyeing the steaming containers. "Tea, and something that isn't that dismal canned soup you seem to favor," he said, moving toward the kitchen without asking. "I couldn't work in this silence. It's like a tomb in here." "I work best in silence," she snapped, "and I didn't ask you to bring me food." "You didn't have to. Your stomach made its opinion known the moment I stepped through the flames." He reappeared in the doorway, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. It was a jarring sight. The Malfoy heir to a manor and 1,000 years of pure-blood etiquette, standing in her cramped kitchen with his forearms exposed. Hermione's breath hitched. There was a jagged scar on his left arm, partially hidden by the fold of his shirt, and for a moment the warmth of his presence was eclipsed by the cold memory of who they used to be. He noticed her stare, and his expression instantly shuttered. The atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to drop. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave. "No," she lied, looking away quickly. "Just put the files down and let's get to work." They worked in a state of high tensile truce for 3 hours. The only sounds were the scratching of quills and the occasional rustle of parchment. But as the rain intensified, so did the proximity. To review the ledgers, Draco had to sit on the edge of the sofa, his thigh inches from her cast. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a steady, rhythmic pulse that made it impossible to concentrate on the finer points of centaur territorial law. "You're overthinking the third clause," he said suddenly, leaning over her shoulder to point at a line of her text. "I am not. It's a matter of legal precedent," she argued, though her heart began to thud against her ribs. He was so close she could see the silver flecks in his grey eyes. "It's a matter of being stubborn for the sake of it," he countered. He reached for the quill in her hand, and for a heartbeat, their fingers brushed. It was a small contact, but it felt like a lightning strike. Hermione flinched back, the repulsion instinctual, a reflex born of years of enmity. Draco pulled his hand away as if burned, his face flushing a dull, angry red. "Don't," he hissed. "I'm not a leper, Granger. I didn't say you were. You surprised me." "Did I? Or are you just reminded that you're being helped by a Death Eater?" The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. The trust that had been tentatively building over the last few days shattered like glass. Hermione felt a wave of guilt, followed immediately by a surge of defensive anger. "That's not fair, Draco. You know it's not just that." "Then what is it? Because every time I try to make this ridiculous situation tolerable, you look at me like I'm something you found on the bottom of your shoe." He stood up abruptly, the ledgers nearly sliding off the table. "I'm doing my job. I'm fulfilling my service. If you want a more agreeable nursemaid, call Weasley." "Ron is in Romania," she shouted, her voice cracking. "And I don't want a nursemaid. I want my life back. I want to be able to walk to the bathroom without feeling like I'm climbing Everest. I want to not be dependent on the one person who spent 7 years making sure I knew I didn't belong in his world." The outburst left her gasping, her lungs burning. She expected him to leave. She expected the green flames and the finality of the flu. Instead, Draco stood perfectly still. The anger in his eyes faded, replaced by a hollow, weary sort of understanding. He looked at her, really looked at her, at the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands were trembling in her lap. "I don't think you don't belong, Hermione," he said, his voice so quiet she almost missed it over the thunder. It was the first time he had ever used her given name. "I haven't thought that in a long time." He walked back to the sofa, but he didn't sit down. He knelt on the floor beside her, bringing himself level with her seated position. It was an act of such profound humility that she felt the air leave her chest. "Your kitchen sink is leaking," he said. The subject changed so abrupt it made her head spin. "What?" "The sink. It's been dripping since I arrived. It's driving me mad." He stood up and walked to the kitchen, leaving her blinking in the dim light of the living room. She heard him rummaging under the sink, the clinking of metal tools, muggled tools that she'd kept in a junk drawer and never learned how to use. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of a construction site. 10 minutes later, he returned, his hands covered in a light sheen of oil and water. He looked absurdly out of place, yet strangely vital. "Fixed," he said shortly. "I'll stay to finish the transcription. You look like you're about to faint." "I'm fine," she whispered, though the warmth was returning, flooding her limbs with a treacherous, sweet ache. "You're a liar," he replied, but there was no bite in it. He sat back down, not on the edge of the sofa this time, but firmly in the armchair opposite her. He picked up a ledger and began to read aloud, his voice a low, steady baritone that acted as a balm to her frayed nerves. As he read, Hermione watched him. She watched the way his throat moved when he swallowed, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. She felt a dangerous shift in the tectonic plates of her heart. The conflict was no longer about the ministry or the past. It was about the present. It was about the fact that she was beginning to find the sound of his voice more comforting than the silence she had always craved. But then he looked up and caught her watching. The doubt returned in an instant. Was this a game? Was he simply being charming to secure a better recommendation for his permanent record? He was a Slytherin, after all. Ambition was his blood. "Is there something on my face, Granger?" "No," she said, her voice hardening. "I was just wondering how much longer this act is going to last." The mask slammed back down, the light in his eyes extinguished. "As long as the Ministry requires it," he said, his voice turning back to ice. "Not a second longer." He went back to the ledger, the cold more biting than before. They stayed that way for another hour, two people in a small room, separated by a sea of parchment and a decade of scars. Hermione turned her gaze to the window, watching the rain wash away the dust of the city, wishing it could as easily wash away the suspicion that prevented her from reaching out. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe the man who fixed her sink and fed her cat was the real Draco Malfoy. But as he stood up to leave, giving her a stiff, formal nod before disappearing into the green flames, she realized the emotional seesaw was only just beginning to swing. The middle of the story was a minefield, and she was walking through it with a broken leg and a heart that was starting to beat for the wrong person. She lay back on the pillows, the silence of the flat now feeling lonelier than ever. Crookshanks hopped up onto her lap, purring as he settled against her cast. "He's a prat, Crookshanks," she whispered into the orange fur. The cat just blinked at her, his golden eyes seemingly unconvinced. Hermione closed her eyes, the echo of Draco's voice reading legal statutes still vibrating in the air, a ghost of a presence that refused to let her rest. She was terrified of what would happen when her leg finally healed, because the thought of him leaving was starting to hurt more than the break itself. The third week arrived with a deceptive stillness, the kind of quiet that precedes a shift in the wind. Hermione's flat had become a strange hybrid space, a sanctuary of scholarship and a battlefield of unspoken tensions. The smell of her old books had been joined by the faint, sharp scent of Draco's expensive parchment and the lingering aroma of the Earl Grey tea he now made without being asked. The physical pain in her leg had transitioned from a sharp scream to a dull, heavy throb. But the mental agitation was reaching a fever pitch. She was a woman defined by action, by being the brightest witch of her age who could solve any puzzle. Yet here she was, unable to even carry a stack of files to the hearth. When Draco arrived that Tuesday, he didn't head straight for the paperwork. He stopped in the middle of the room, his eyes scanning the space with a critical silver intensity. "This place is a fire hazard, Granger," he remarked, his voice smooth but edged with a strange restlessness. "These floorboards in the corner are bowing, and your bookshelf is leaning at a precarious 15-degree angle. If it collapses, you'll be buried under a mountain of charms texts before I can flew back." "It's an old building, Draco. It has character," Hermione snapped, though she felt a flush of embarrassment. She was currently trying to reach a fallen quill on the floor, her fingers brushing the carpet in a futile stretch that made her feel like a grounded beetle. Before she could protest, he was there. He didn't just pick up the quill. He knelt beside the sofa, his presence looming and large in her small living room. Instead of handing it back immediately, he looked at her, his gaze dropping to her cast and then back to her face. "You've been crying," he said. It wasn't a question. "I haven't. It's the dust. You just said the place was a mess, she lied, her voice thick. He didn't pull away. For a moment, the warmth between them was almost stifling. He reached out, his thumb hovering just a fraction of an inch from her cheek, as if he meant to wipe away a stray tear. Hermione held her breath, her heart performing a frantic, irregular rhythm. She found herself leaning toward him, a magnetic pull she couldn't control. Then the seesaw tilted. He seemed to catch himself, his eyes widening slightly as he realized the intimacy of the gesture. He stood up abruptly, his face hardening into that familiar porcelain mask of aristocratic disdain. "Pathetic," he muttered, tossing the quill onto her lap as if it were trash. "You're letting a few weeks of boredom turn you into a puddle. I expected more steel from the woman who punched me in third year." The repulsion was immediate. The sting of his words hit harder than the pain in her leg. Hermione felt the familiar wall of her own pride slam into place, cold and unyielding. "I'm so sorry my human emotions are an inconvenience to your remarkable grace, Malfoy," she spat, the use of his surname a deliberate strike. "If you find me so pathetic, why do you keep coming back? Why stay and fix the sink? Why feed the cat? Why not just leave the documents on the porch and let me rot?" Draco's jaw worked, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He looked like he wanted to scream, but instead he turned his back on her and walked into the kitchen. "I have a court mandate, Granger. Do not flatter yourself by thinking I enjoy spending my afternoons in this shoebox." She heard him slamming cupboards, the sound of heavy ceramic hitting the counter. "And since you're clearly incapable of basic self-preservation, I'm making dinner. Not because I care, but because a malnourished witness is a legal liability." "I don't want your dinner. Eat it, or I'll transfigure it into a sedative and force-feed you," he yelled back. The conflict was raw now, stripped of the polite veneer of colleagues. They were two people trapped in a cycle of needing and hating that need. Hermione sat on the sofa, her hands clenched into fists, listening to the sounds of a man who claimed to loathe her as he prepared a meal for her. An hour later, a plate of perfectly seared salmon and wilted greens was placed on the table before her. Draco sat in the armchair, his own plate in his hand, eating in a silence that felt like a physical weight. "It's good," she whispered after the first bite, the warmth creeping back in despite her best efforts to stay angry. "Of course it is. The Malfoy kitchens are legendary, and I didn't spend my youth entirely idle," he said, though he didn't look up. "Thank you, Draco." He paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second there was a sense of trust, a bridge being built over the chasm of their past. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes matching her own. "My mother is asking about you," he said quietly. The bridge crumbled. Hermione's mind raced. Narcissa Malfoy? Why would she ask? Was this part of some larger play? Was Draco being pressured to find out ministry secrets through her while she was vulnerable? The doubt surged, black and oily. "Why would she care?" Hermione asked, her voice turning cold. "Is she looking for an opening in the Department of International Magical Cooperation? Or is she just curious how the mudblood is handling her injury?" The silence that followed was deafening. Draco didn't explode. He didn't yell. He simply put his plate down on the table with a slow, deliberate precision that was far more terrifying than a shout. He stood up, his height making the room feel even smaller. "You really can't help yourself, can you?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "You preach about moving forward and unity, but the moment someone offers a hand, you look for the knife hidden in their sleeve." "I have every reason to look for the knife. I've been in your home for 3 weeks, Granger. I've fixed your pipes, I've handled your correspondence, I've made sure you didn't starve while your friends were too busy to visit. If I wanted to hurt you, I could have done it 1,000 times over." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "My mother is asking because she is a woman who knows what it is to be isolated. She knows what it's like to have the world wait for you to fail. But God forbid I try to bridge that gap. God forbid we be anything more than the roles we were assigned at 11 years old." He grabbed his coat from the rack. "Wait," she said, her voice small. "Draco, Save it. I'll bring the final drafts tomorrow. Don't worry, I won't stay for tea. I wouldn't want to contaminate your heroic atmosphere with my presence." The flue flared, and he was gone. Hermione sat in the darkening room, the salmon turning cold on her plate. She looked at the bookshelf he had pointed out earlier. He was right. It was leaning. Everything in her life was leaning. She felt a deep, hollow ache in her chest that had nothing to do with her leg. She had pushed him away because it was safer than letting him in. She had used his past as a shield against the terrifying possibility of a future that included him. The emotional seesaw had swung so hard it felt like it had snapped. She had gone from wanting to touch his hand to accusing his mother of espionage in the span of an hour. The betrayal wasn't his, it was hers. She had betrayed the progress they had made because she was afraid of the change. Internal monologue raced. Why am I doing this? Why can't I just let it be easy? But as she looked at the empty armchair, she realized that easy was never going to be an option for them. They were forged in fire, and every step toward each other was a step through the flames. She looked at Crookshanks, who was staring at the fireplace with a mournful expression. "I know," she whispered. "I'm a mess." That night, she didn't sleep. She listened to the creaking of the old floorboards and the dripping of the rain. For the first time in her life, the silence of her flat wasn't a comfort. It was a reminder of everything she was losing by being right. She realized then that the conflict wasn't about her leg, or the ministry, or the war. The conflict was the terrifying realization that she was falling in love with a man she was supposed to loathe, and that she was doing a much better job of destroying that love than he ever could. She reached out and touched the spot on the sofa where he had sat, finding only the cold texture of the velvet. The middle of the story was becoming a tragedy of her own making, and as the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, Hermione Granger made a silent vow. When the green flames returned today, she would be the one to bridge the gap, even if she had to crawl to do it. The morning light was grey and unforgiving, filtering through the grime of the London windows to illuminate every speck of dust Hermione had been unable to reach. She had spent the dawn hours repositioning herself, a grueling exercise in stubbornness that involved dragging her cast-laden body toward the center of the sofa. She wanted to be ready. She wanted to be the first to speak. She had rehearsed an apology, a deconstruction of her own defensiveness, that sounded, in her head, like a closing argument at the Wizengamot. When the clock struck 9, the flue remained dark. By 10 o'clock, the silence in the flat had become a physical weight. Hermione stared at the cold ashes in the grate, her heart sinking with every passing minute. The doubt she had cast upon him yesterday now turned inward, sharp and accusing. "You pushed too hard," her mind whispered. "You reminded him of the very thing he's trying to escape, and now he's finally realized that no mandate is worth this much misery." The cold of her isolation was absolute. She tried to focus on a report concerning the regulation of flue powder quality, but the words swam before her eyes. Without his presence to push against, she felt herself drifting. The apartment felt like a ghost ship. Even Crookshanks seemed despondent, pacing the length of the hallway and sniffing at the cracks in the floorboards Draco had promised to fix. At noon, the fire suddenly roared into life. Hermione's breath hitched. She sat up straight, ignoring the protest of her hip. But it wasn't Draco who stepped out. It was a ministry owl, a sleek, impersonal creature that dropped a heavy scroll onto her lap and vanished back into the flames before she could even utter a word of inquiry. The parchment was cold to the touch. It was a formal notification. Consultant Malfoy has been reassigned to an urgent audit in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Your remaining documents will be handled via owl post until your medical clearance is granted. We wish you a speedy recovery. The rejection was so total, so clinical, that it felt like a slap. Hermione crumpled the parchment in her fist. This was the repulsion she had triggered. She had demanded he leave, and he had used his influence to make it permanent. The house felt smaller than ever, a tomb where she was the only living thing. She spent the next few hours in a state of icy, productive rage. If he wasn't coming, she would finish the work herself. She would prove she didn't need his hands to feed the cat or his voice to fill the room. She reached for a stack of files on the far end of the coffee table, overextending her reach. The table wobbled. The very table Draco had warned her was unstable. With a sickening crash, the tea service slid, the ledgers toppled, and Hermione found herself sprawling toward the floor, her cast hitting the hardwood with a thud that vibrated through her teeth. She didn't scream. She stayed there, pinned between the sofa and the floor, the warmth of her anger turning into the cold, wet reality of spilled cold tea soaking into her sweater. "I hate this," she whispered into the carpet. "I hate him. I hate everything." The flue flared again. "Granger, if you've managed to kill yourself in the 3 hours since I sent that owl, I am going to be extremely annoyed." She froze. Draco was standing by the hearth, not in his pristine suit, but in a thick, dark jumper and trousers that looked suspiciously like work clothes. He took in the scene, the spilled tea, the toppled table, and Hermione, looking like a broken bird on the floor. He didn't laugh. He didn't offer a sarcastic remark. He crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping to his knees beside her. "Don't touch me," she sobbed, the distrust flaring up one last time as a defense against the sheer relief of seeing him. "You were reassigned. Go back to your audit." "I wrote that notice myself, you idiot," he muttered, his hands firm as he slid them under her arms to hoist her back onto the sofa. "I needed to get the ministry off my back," so I could actually get some work done around here without being questioned about billable hours. Now, sit still before you do permanent damage." He lifted her with a strength that was effortless, settling her back onto the cushions. The approach was so sudden, so intimate, that she forgot to breathe. He stayed close for a moment longer than necessary, his face inches from hers, checking for signs of shock. "Why?" she breathed, her voice trembling. "I was horrible to you yesterday." "You were," he agreed, though his eyes were surprisingly soft. "You were cynical, biased, and incredibly frustrating. But you were also right. I haven't earned your trust, Hermione. I've been trying to buy it with salmon and fixed sinks, but that's not how it works, is it?" He stood up and began writing the table, his movements methodical. "I stayed away this morning because I had to decide if I was here because I had to be or because I wanted to be. And then I realized the floorboards in your hallway were still creaking, and the thought of you tripping over them made me feel more panicked than the prospect of a lifetime in Azkaban." The warmth flooded back into her, a dizzying golden tide. She watched him as he moved to the kitchen, returning with a damp cloth to clean up the tea. "I'm sorry," she said, the words finally finding their way out. "About your mother. About everything. I use the past as a weapon because I'm afraid of how much power you have over my present." Draco paused, the cloth in his hand. He looked at her, and the trust between them felt for the first time like something solid. "I don't want power over you, Granger. I just want to be able to stay in the room without you looking for an exit." He spent the rest of the afternoon working, not on ministry documents, but on the flat. He brought in a toolbox from the hallway, he must have left it there earlier, and began to reinforce the leaning bookshelf. The sounds of manual labor filled the space, a rhythmic, grounding counterpoint to the internal monologue of her heart. He stayed through the evening. As the sun set, the atmosphere shifted from professional to something domestic and heavy with unspoken potential. The emotional seesaw had steadied, but the tension was higher than ever. Every time he moved past her, his hand would brush the back of the sofa. Every time she spoke, he would stop and listen, as if her words were the only thing that mattered. "I'm making dinner," he announced around 7. "And don't you dare mention my mother or the ministry. This is just food." "What are we having?" she asked, the "we" slipping out before she could catch it. Draco's smirk was slow and devastating. "Something Muggle. Since you're so fond of character, I thought I'd try my hand at a proper roast." As he worked in the kitchen, the smell of rosemary and garlic began to drift through the flat. It was the smell of a home, not a cage. Hermione found herself leaning back, her eyes closing, listening to the man she once considered her greatest enemy hum a low, unrecognizable tune. But as the night deepened and the wind began to howl outside, a new kind of doubt crept in. This felt like a dream, a temporary suspension of reality brought on by a broken bone. What happens when the cast comes off? What happens when she doesn't need him to carry the files? She opened her eyes and saw him standing in the doorway, watching her. The look on his face wasn't one of a consultant or a rival. It was the look of a man who was terrified to take the next step. "The bookshelf is finished," he said, his voice husky. "It won't fall on you." "Thank you, Draco." "I should probably go," he said, though he didn't move. The storm is getting worse, she noted, her heart hammering. The flu might be congested again. The cold of the night pressed against the windows, but the warmth in the room was palpable. The invitation hung between them, a fragile thing that could shatter at a single wrong word. Draco looked at the fireplace, then back at her, his silver eyes dark with a conflict that had been building for 3 weeks. "I could stay," he whispered, "just until the storm passes, to make sure the roof doesn't leak." "Yes," Hermione replied, her voice barely a breath. "Stay. I think the roof might need looking at." He didn't move toward her yet, but the shift in the room was seismic. The beginning of the end had started. The documents were forgotten, the cat was asleep, and for the first time in her life, Hermione Granger wasn't looking for a solution. She was simply waiting for him to bridge the remaining few feet of the room. The conflict of the day was over, but the slow burn of the night was just beginning. The storm outside was no longer a mere meteorological event. It was a physical barrier that had successfully severed Hermione's flat from the rest of the wizarding world. The wind shrieked against the brickwork, rattling the glass in its frames. But inside, the air was thick, still, and heavy with the scent of roasted herbs and the dying embers of the hearth. Draco did not go back to the armchair. After the roast had been cleared away, a meal eaten in a charged, vibrating silence, he moved to the hearth. He knelt, not to leave, but to tend the fire. He moved with a grace that felt almost ritualistic, stoking the logs until the orange glow cast long, dancing shadows across the walls. "The wind is coming from the north," he said, his back to her. "It's going to get colder before morning." "I have extra blankets in the linen cupboard," Hermione said. She was hyper-aware of him, of the way the firelight caught the sharp line of his jaw and the way his shoulders moved under the dark wool of his jumper. The approach had been made, the invitation accepted, but the repulsion of her own fear was still whispering in the back of her mind. "This is a bubble," she thought. "Bubbles are designed to burst." He turned to look at her, his silhouette framed by the flames. "I'll stay here, on the rug. I don't want to leave you alone while the building is shaking like this." "The rug? Draco, don't be ridiculous. The floor is freezing." "I've slept in worse places," he replied, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register that made her skin prickle. He was referring to the war, to the manor, to the months spent looking over his shoulder. The cold of the past was always there, a phantom limb that neither of them could truly shake. "Take the armchair at least," she insisted. He hesitated, then moved closer, leaning his hip against the edge of the sofa near her feet. "You're a terrible patient, Granger. You spend all your energy worrying about everyone else's comfort while you're the one with a hole in your leg." "I don't have a hole. I have a fracture, and I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're exhausted." He reached out, and this time there was no hesitation. He placed his hand over her ankle, just above the edge of the cast. His touch was warm, steady, and incredibly grounding. The warmth that radiated from his palm felt like it was knitting more than just bone. It was knitting the frayed edges of her nerves. For a long moment, they stayed like that, the only two people in the world, anchored to each other by a few square inches of skin. "Why did you really come back today?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could censor it. "Beyond the floorboards and the audit." Draco's thumb traced a slow, rhythmic circle against her skin. He looked down at his hand, his expression unreadable. Because when I was sitting in that audit, looking at spreadsheets of confiscated dark artifacts, all I could think about was the way you bite your lip when you're trying to solve a particularly difficult translation. And I realized that I'd rather be insulted by you in this flat than be praised by anyone else in the world. The honesty of it was a betrayal of everything she thought she knew about him. It was a surrender. Hermione felt her eyes sting, the trust she had been hoarding like a secret finally overflowing. "I don't want to insult you anymore," she whispered. He looked up, his grey eyes searching hers. "Then what do you want, Hermione?" The use of her name was no longer a novelty. It was a claim. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she brushed a stray blonde hair away from his forehead. "I want you to stay, not because of the storm, and not because of the ministry." The tension in his shoulders seemed to snap. He moved with a sudden, fluid urgency, shifting from the floor to the narrow space on the sofa beside her. He was careful of her leg, mindful of her pain, but his presence was overwhelming. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. "If I stay," he murmured, his voice a warning, "I'm not sure I can go back to being just a consultant tomorrow." "Good," she breathed. "I was never very good at following the rules anyway." He let out a short, jagged laugh that was cut off when he buried his face in the crook of her neck. He didn't kiss her, not yet, but he held her with a desperation that spoke of years of loneliness. Hermione wrapped her arms around him, her fingers curling into the soft wool of his jumper. But then, as always, the seesaw tilted. A loud, sudden crack echoed from the kitchen, a sound like a gunshot. Draco was on his feet in an instant, wand drawn, his face transformed into a mask of lethal efficiency. The repulsion of his past life as a soldier flared back to the surface. He looked cold, dangerous, and entirely separate from the man who had just been holding her. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice like iron. "Draco, wait." He disappeared into the kitchen, his movements silent and predatory. Hermione sat frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. Was it an intruder, a Death Eater seeking revenge, or just the building finally giving way? The doubt returned with a vengeance. She realized how little she actually knew of the world he still moved in when he wasn't with her. A moment later, he returned. His shoulders slumped and his wand held loosely at his side. He looked sheepish, the lethal mask dissolving back into the man she recognized. "It was the shelf," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "The one I fixed earlier. Apparently your walls are even more decayed than I thought." The masonry crumbled and the whole thing came down. Hermione let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She started to laugh, a hysterical, bubbling sound that filled the room. The great Draco Malfoy, defeated by a bit of Victorian plaster. He scowled, but there was a glint of amusement in his eyes. "It's not funny. I'll have to rebuild the entire wall now. It's a structural hazard." "You said that about the floorboards too." "The floorboards are a hazard." He sat back down beside her, the adrenaline fading into a comfortable, weary warmth. "I'll fix it tomorrow. I'll stay and fix everything, Hermione. One brick at a time, if I have to." The warmth returned, deeper this time, more permanent. The The conflict of the night, the fear of the unknown and the weight of the past was being resolved by the simple, mundane reality of a broken shelf. "You're going to be here for a long time then," she noted, her hand finding his again. "This flat has a lot of problems." "I'm a patient man," he replied, his voice softening. He leaned back, pulling her against his chest. She rested her head on his shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside, the slow burn had finally reached a steady, glowing heat. As the hours ticked toward midnight, the conversation drifted. They talked about things they had never dared to mention: his childhood at the manor, her summers in the Muggle world, the books they both loved, and the ways they had both been broken by the war. It was a clearing of the air, a final removal of the cold barriers that had kept them apart. "I used to watch you in the library," he admitted quietly, his hand stroking her hair. "In 6th year, you were the only thing that felt solid. Like if I could just focus on the sound of your quill, the rest of the world wouldn't fall apart." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I was a coward, and because I didn't think I deserved to breathe the same air as you, let alone speak to you." Hermione pulled back just enough to look him in the eye. "We're a long way from 6th year, Draco." "We are," he agreed. He leaned in then, his hand cupping her jaw. This was the moment the tension had been building toward for weeks. The final shift from repulsion to approach. His lips were inches from hers, the heat between them almost unbearable. But just as he was about to close the distance, Crookshanks, who had been forgotten in the drama of the falling shelf, decided to make his presence known. With a loud, demanding yowl, he leapt onto the sofa, landing squarely on the middle of Hermione's cast. "Ow! Crookshanks, no!" she cried, half laughing and half wincing in pain. Draco groaned, leaning his forehead against the back of the sofa. "That cat is a menace. He has the worst timing in the history of magical creatures." "He's just protective," Hermione said, stroking the cat's ears. Draco looked at the cat, then at Hermione, and finally he started to laugh. It was a real laugh, bright and genuine, and it broke the last of the tension in the room. "Fine," he said, standing up. "If I can't have the girl, I'll at least make sure the cat doesn't destroy the furniture. I'm going to see if I can salvage anything from that shelf." He walked toward the kitchen, but he stopped at the door and looked back. "Don't go anywhere, Granger." "I have a broken leg, Draco. Where would I go?" "To my head," he whispered. "You've been there for years. I don't think you're ever leaving." He disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Hermione alone with a purring cat and a heart that felt like it was finally, truly home. The 5th part of their story was closing, not with a kiss, but with something better. The knowledge that there were still 3 more parts to come, and a lifetime after that to finish the repairs. She looked at the fire, which was now burning steady and strong. The emotional seesaw had finally found its balance. There would still be doubt, and there would still be cold days. But for tonight, there was only the warmth of a man in her kitchen and the promise of a morning where the green flames wouldn't mean goodbye. The wreckage of the kitchen shelf was a literal and metaphorical mess, a heap of splintered pine and shattered porcelain that Draco began to clear with a focused, almost meditative intensity. Hermione could hear the rhythmic clatter of debris being cleared, the occasional sharp tap of his wand as he performed minor reparative charms. The domesticity of the sound was a lure, pulling her mind away from the dull ache of her leg and toward the vibrant, terrifying reality of the man in the next room. For the first time since the accident, she felt a different kind of restlessness. It wasn't the frustration of being trapped, it was the urge to reach out. She watched the firelight flicker against the spines of the books he had just straightened, feeling a surge of warmth that felt dangerously close to devotion. He wasn't just fixing her flat. He was tending to the invisible fractures she had carried since the war ended. But when Draco returned to the doorway, his expression had shifted. The light-heartedness of his earlier laugh had been replaced by a brooding, silver-eyed intensity. He was holding a small leather-bound volume that had been tucked behind the collapsed shelf, a diary she hadn't touched in years. "I found this," he said, his voice dropping into a cold, guarded tone. It was wedged in the masonry. Hermione's heart stopped. She recognized the binding immediately. It was her journal from the year following the Battle of Hogwarts, filled with raw, jagged entries about the trials, the Malfoys, and the bitterness of a world trying to heal too quickly. "Give it to me," she said, her voice trembling. He didn't move. He looked at the cover, his knuckles white. "I saw my name, Hermione, on the first page I opened." The betrayal felt instantaneous. The privacy of her thoughts was a fortress she hadn't expected him to breach. "You had no right to read that. That was a different time. I was angry at everyone. You called me a hollow coward who deserved to rot in the ruins of his own name," he quoted, the words falling from his lips like shards of ice. The repulsion was visible in the way he stepped back, as if the air around her had suddenly become toxic. "Is that what I am to you? A project? A way to prove you're better than the girl who wrote those words? No. Draco, listen to me. I've spent weeks in this shoebox, thinking we were finally seeing each other," he snapped, his voice rising with a sharp, jagged edge of hurt. "But I'm just the same villain to you, aren't I? Just a bit more useful because I can fix a sink and carry your bags." The doubt was a physical weight in the room, suffocating and dark. Hermione struggled to sit up, her cast dragging against the floor. "That was written 7 years ago. Do you think I would have let you stay here? Do you think I would have let you feed my cat or cook for me if I still felt that way? I think you're Hermione Granger," he said, his voice dripping with a sudden cruel bitterness. "And you love a lost cause. You love a broken thing that you can mend to satisfy your own sense of morality." He tossed the diary onto the coffee table. The sound was like a gavel striking. He turned toward the flue, his movements frantic, driven by the cold instinct to flee before he could be rejected further. "If you leave now," Hermione shouted, her voice cracking with desperation, "you're proving her right. You're proving that you are a coward who runs the moment things get difficult." Draco froze, his hand inches from the jar of Floo powder. He stood perfectly still, his back to her, his breathing heavy and ragged. The silence that followed was agonizing, filled only with the sound of the rain and the crackle of the dying fire. Slowly, he turned around. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed with a mixture of rage and profound sorrow. "I am tired of fighting my own ghost, Hermione," he whispered. I come here and I feel like I can breathe. And then I see that. And I realize I'm just a monster who's been invited into the parlor for a bit of entertainment. You are not a monster, she said, her voice softening into a plea. She reached out, her hand trembling in the air between them. And you aren't a project. You're the only person who has actually stayed. Harry and Ron, they have their own lives. They visit, they send owls, but they don't stay. You stayed when it was ugly. You stayed when I was snapping at you. You stayed when you had every reason to walk away. The trust began to pull at the edges of his resolve. He looked at her hand, then at her face. The warmth of her gaze was a direct challenge to the ice in his chest. I didn't stay because of a mandate, he admitted, his voice barely audible. I know, she replied, and I didn't let you stay because of the ministry. He walked back toward her, his steps slow and hesitant, like a man walking across a frozen lake. He sat on the edge of the sofa, not touching her yet, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. I'm terrified, he confessed, looking at his hands. If this ends, if you heal, and I go back to being just Malfoy, I don't think I'll survive the quiet again. Then don't let it be quiet, she said. She reached out and took his hand, forcing his fingers to intertwine with hers. The contact was electric, a grounding wire for the storm of emotions swirling between them. The approach was complete. The conflict of their past was being laid to rest, replaced by the terrifying, beautiful uncertainty of their present. I'm going to finish fixing that wall, he said, after a long moment, though he didn't let go of her hand. And then I'm going to stay the night, on the armchair, because the storm isn't over and I don't trust the roof. The roof is fine, Draco, she said, a small, watery smile touching her lips. The roof is a disaster, he corrected, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. It needs constant supervision. The warmth returned to the flat, deeper and more resonant than before. As Draco went back to the kitchen, the sounds of his work were no longer just domestic. They were a promise. Hermione leaned back, the diary forgotten on the table. She realized that the emotional seesaw wasn't something to be feared. It was the mechanism of their growth. Every push and pull brought them closer to a center they had both spent a lifetime trying to find. As the clock struck 2 a.m, Draco finally emerged from the kitchen, his clothes dusted with plaster, but his eyes clear. He didn't say anything. He simply moved to the armchair, settled in, and looked at her. Sleep, Hermione, he said softly. Stay, she whispered. I'm not going anywhere, he promised. The 6th part of their journey ended in the quiet, flickering light of a home that was being rebuilt, one conversation and one repaired wall at a time. The burn was no longer slow. It was a steady, consuming heat that promised to light the way through the final 2 chapters of their isolation. Hermione closed her eyes, the sound of his breathing the only lullaby she needed, knowing that when the sun rose, the man in the chair would still be there, and the story would still be theirs to write. The dawn that followed the storm was a pale, pearlescent grey, casting a soft light over the living room that made everything look new and fragile. Hermione woke to the sound of the kettle whistling, a muggle sound that felt surreal coming from her kitchen while Draco Malfoy was the one tending to it. Her leg felt heavy, a reminder of her limitations, but the suffocating weight of the previous week's isolation had vanished. Draco appeared in the doorway, 2 mugs in hand. He looked different, dishevelled in a way that made him appear human rather than a curated portrait. His hair was mussed from a night spent in the armchair, and his jaw was shadowed with stubble. He didn't speak as he handed her the tea. He simply sat on the edge of the sofa, his presence a quiet, solid warmth that anchored her. "The roof held," he said, his voice husky with sleep. "But the garden gate is off its hinges. I'll see to it before I head to the ministry to drop off the overnight drafts." "You're leaving?" The question jumped out of her mouth before she could stop it, sharp with a sudden icy repulsion at the thought of the empty flat. The doubt flared up. Would he go to the ministry and realize that the world outside was easier than the complicated emotional labyrinth of her living room? Draco paused, his mug halfway to his lips. He looked at her, seeing the flash of panic in her eyes. "I have to file the paperwork, Hermione. If I don't show my face, they'll send a search party, and the last thing we need is a squad of auras interrupting your breakfast." He reached out, his hand covering her knee, just above the cast. "I'm coming back. I'm bringing the rest of the dossiers on the Muggle-Born Protection Act, and some proper bread." The tension in her chest eased, the trust returning like a slow-moving tide. "I didn't think you liked proper bread. I thought you only ate artisan sourdough delivered by Owl." "I'm adapting," he said with a wry smirk. The day proceeded in a strange, suspended state of anticipation. When he left through the flue, the flat felt cavernous, but it wasn't the tomb it had been before. The scent of him remained, sandalwood and expensive ink, blending with the smell of the old books. Hermione worked with a ferocity she hadn't felt in weeks, her mind sharp and fueled by a desire to impress the man who would be reviewing her notes. But as the afternoon stretched on, the cold began to seep back in. He was late. 1 hour became 2. The seesaw tilted toward betrayal. Of course, she thought, staring at the green-tinged ashes. He's at the manor, or he's at a pub with people who don't have broken legs and messy diaries. He's realized that I'm a burden. Internal monologues spun a web of worst-case scenarios, her pride whispering that she should have never let him stay the night. When the flue finally roared, she was ready with a sharp remark, her defenses high and jagged. Draco stepped out, but he didn't look like a man who had been enjoying himself. His lip was cut, and his robes were torn at the shoulder. He looked exhausted, his silver eyes dark with a simmering, volatile rage. "What happened?" Hermione gasped, her anger vanishing in an instant, replaced by a frantic approach. "Draco, you're bleeding!" "It's nothing," he snapped, his voice a razor-edged repulsion. He walked past her, heading straight for the kitchen to splash water on his face. Just a few concerned citizens who didn't appreciate a Malfoy walking the halls of the ministry without a leash. "Did they attack you? Who was it?" "It doesn't matter," he yelled, the sound echoing off the newly repaired walls. He turned to face her, his face a mask of bitter, ancient pain. "This is what it is, Hermione. Every time I think I can just be a man, the world reminds me that I'm a brand, a stain. You shouldn't be seen with me. It's bad for your career. It's bad for your image. I'm a liability." The warmth of the previous night felt like a hallucination. The conflict was no longer between them, but between them and the rest of the world. Draco paced the small kitchen, his movements jerky and violent, I came back here to protect you from the storm, but I'm the one bringing the lightning, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Maybe you were right in your diary. Maybe I am just a hollow coward. Stop it, Hermione said, her voice firm. She reached for her crutches, which he had insisted she use sparingly, and pulled herself up. It was a struggle, a slow and painful ascent, but she refused to let him stay in that dark place alone. She hobbled to the kitchen doorway, leaning heavily against the frame. Look at me, Draco. He didn't want to. He kept his head down, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the counter. Look at me, she repeated. Slowly, he raised his gaze. The vulnerability in his eyes was staggering. You aren't a liability to me, she said, her heart hammering. You are the person who fixed my sink. You are the person who fed my cat when I couldn't move. You are the man who stayed when the shelf fell, and the man who stayed when the storm hit. If the world wants to judge you for your name, let them. But don't you dare use their ignorance as an excuse to pull away from me. The trust was a bridge they were building in real time, one word at a time. Draco took a step toward her, then another, until he was standing right in front of her. He reached out, his hands hovering over her waist, afraid to touch her, afraid to break the fragile peace they had found. I don't want to ruin you, he whispered. You couldn't, she replied. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. The warmth was back, but it was different now. It was tempered by the reality of the fight ahead. The slow burn had turned into a hearth fire, something they had to feed and protect. I fixed the garden gate, he said, a small broken laugh escaping him. Before I went to the ministry. I wanted you to see it when you finally looked out the window. I don't need to look out the window, she said, her hand reaching up to touch the cut on his lip. Everything I want to see is right here. The tension broke, not with a kiss, but with a deep, shuddering sigh of relief. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a gentleness that was at odds with the violence of his day. They stayed like that for a long time, two people finding a sanctuary in the middle of a war that hadn't quite ended. Stay, she whispered into his chest. Not for the storm, not for the roof. I'm staying, he promised. I'm staying until you're tired of me, and then I'm staying a little longer. The seventh part of their story closed with a quiet, domestic resolve. The conflict of the world outside was still there, but inside the flat, the walls were strong, the fire was bright, and the man who had been forced to carry her documents was now the only one she wanted to carry her heart. They sat back on the sofa, the paperwork forgotten, as the sun began to set on the seventh day of her recovery, the day the emotional seesaw finally stopped swinging and settled into a steady, beautiful equilibrium. Only one part remained. The cast was coming off soon, and with it, the physical cage that had brought them together. But as Hermione watched Draco bank the fire, she knew that the end of her confinement was only the beginning of something much larger. She wasn't afraid of the quiet anymore. She was ready for the noise of the world, as long as he was there to meet it with her. The 8th week dawned not with a storm, but with a clinical, sterile clarity. The healer from St. Mungo's had arrived early, her wand humming with the specific, sharp resonance of diagnostic charms. With a flick of her wrist and a quiet incantation, the heavy, archaic cast, the stone-like weight that had anchored Hermione to this sofa, and this version of her life split down the center and vanished into a puff of white dust. "Flex your ankle, dear," the healer said, oblivious to the tectonic shift occurring in the room. Hermione moved her foot. It was light. It was free. The skin was pale, and the muscles felt like water, but the bone was whole. The physical cage was gone. "You're cleared for light duty. Try not to jump off any more collapsing shelves for at least a month," the healer finished, gathering her things and exiting through the flue. The silence that followed was terrifying. Hermione stood up, her legs shaking as they took her full weight for the first time in 2 months. She took one step, then another, walking toward the window. Behind her, she heard the rustle of parchment. Draco was at the coffee table, methodically stacking the last of the ministry files into his leather satchel. The cold realization hit her like a physical blow. The emotional seesaw had reached its final, most dangerous peak. The conflict of necessity was over. He had fulfilled his mandate. She had fulfilled her recovery. There were no more leaking sinks, no more broken shelves, and no more documents to carry. The repulsion of reality was setting in. The world where he was a Malfoy and she was a Granger, and they lived in different spheres of London. "Well," Draco said, his back to her. His voice was perfectly level, a masterpiece of pure-blood restraint that made her chest ache. "The Centaur decree is finished. Your leg is mended. I suppose even the ministry can't justify my presence in your living room any longer." "I suppose not," she whispered, her back still to him. She watched the pedestrians on the street below, people moving with purpose, people who didn't have hearts caught in their throats. "I'll take these to Kingsley's office immediately. You should probably rest today. Don't overdo the walking." He moved toward the hearth, the satchel heavy over his shoulder. The warmth of the last few weeks felt like it was being sucked out through the cracks in the floorboards. Hermione turned around, her fingers digging into the windowsill. "Is that it then? A professional handover?" Draco stopped. He looked at her, and for a second the doubt in his eyes was so profound it was paralyzing. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for a push or a hand to pull him back. "What do you want me to say, Hermione?" he asked, his voice cracking. "That I've spent the last 60 days falling into a trap of my own making? That I don't know how to go back to my house because it doesn't have your books or your annoying cat or the smell of your tea? Then don't go," she said, taking a step toward him. Her gait was uneven, but her gaze was steady. "I have to go. If I stay, it's not because of a broken leg or a court order. If I stay, it's because I choose to. And if I choose to, and you realize in a week that you only liked the idea of me while you were bored and trapped, I won't survive it." The betrayal of his own self-worth was his final barrier. He was protecting himself from the rejection he was certain was coming. Hermione didn't stop until she was standing directly in his space, her hand reaching up to grip the lapel of his coat. "You think I'm that shallow?" she asked, her voice fierce. "You think I let you see my diary and cook for me and stay through the night just because I was bored? I am Hermione Granger. I don't do anything just to pass the time." She reached up, her thumb brushing the line of his jaw. "The leg is healed, Draco, but I think my roof is still leaking, and I'm fairly certain that bookshelf is going to need a more permanent fix. I think I need a high-level consultant on a much more permanent basis. The approach was final. The warmth returned, not as a flickering flame, but as a steady, roaring heat. Draco dropped the satchel. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, forgotten as he reached for her. He pulled her flush against him, his hands sliding into her hair, his forehead dropping against hers. "You're a nightmare, Granger," he murmured, his breath hot against her skin. "And you're a prat, Malfoy." He didn't wait for her to say anything else. He leaned down and captured her lips with a hunger that had been building since the first day he stepped through the green flames. It wasn't a soft kiss. It was a collision. It tasted of salt and tea and the sheer, desperate relief of two people who had finally stopped fighting their own hearts. Hermione wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, her fingers tangling in the blonde hair she had spent weeks wanting to touch. Every seesaw moment, every sharp word, and every silent night led to this, the resolution of a decade of friction. When they finally broke apart for air, Draco didn't let her go. He tucked her head under his chin, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a shifting world. "Stay," she whispered into his chest. "Always," he replied. He pulled back just enough to look at her, a slow, genuine smile breaking across his face, the kind of smile he had never shown the world, reserved only for the woman who had forced him to see himself differently. He leaned down again, this time more gently, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the corner of her mouth, then her cheek, then her forehead. "I should go to the ministry," he said, though he didn't move an inch. "Kingsley is expecting these." "The ministry can wait," Hermione said, reaching down to take his hand. She led him away from the hearth and toward the kitchen. "I think the cat needs feeding, and I'm fairly certain you promised to show me how to make that roast again." The story of the girl with the broken leg ended there, in the soft afternoon light of a flat that was no longer a cage, but a beginning. The documents remained on the floor, the flue remained dark, and for the first time in her life, Hermione Granger wasn't looking for a plan or a decree. She was simply living in the happy, romantic ending she had built with the most unlikely of architects. As they stood in the kitchen, the sounds of their laughter mingled with the purring of a very satisfied cat. The conflict was resolved. The development was complete. And as Draco leaned down to kiss her one last time before starting the tea, Hermione knew that the best stories weren't the ones where everything was perfect. They were the ones where, despite the breaks and the cracks, you found a way to knit back together, stronger and warmer than before. The 9th and final week arrived not as an ending, but as an unveiling. The flat, which had once felt like a sterile prison of recovery, had been transformed into a shared sanctuary where the shadows of the past were finally outshone by the light of the present. Hermione stood in the center of the room, testing the strength of her leg by reaching for a book on the highest shelf, the very shelf Draco had reinforced. She felt no pain, only the solid, reliable support of a home that had been mended with care. She was dressed to leave, her coat draped over the armchair, but she found herself lingering, reluctant to break the spell of the morning. The flue flared a gentle, rhythmic green, and Draco stepped out. He wasn't carrying documents today. He was carrying a bouquet of white peonies and a small, elegantly wrapped box. He paused, his eyes sweeping over her, taking in her standing position and the vibrant colour in her cheeks. "You're walking," he said, his voice soft, devoid of the cold drawl that had once been his shield. "And you're dressed for the world. The healer gave me a final clean bill of health this morning," Hermione said, stepping toward him with a grace that felt like a victory. "I'm heading back to the ministry, my own office this time." The warmth in the room was absolute, a steady equilibrium that no longer needed the seesaw of conflict to sustain it. Draco set the flowers on the table, now perfectly level and polished, and closed the distance between them. "I suppose that means my services as a courier are officially terminated," he murmured, his hands finding her waist. The touch was familiar now, a silent language of trust that they had written together over 81 days of forced proximity. "On the contrary," Hermione replied, her hands sliding up his chest to rest against the warm pulse of his neck. "I find I've grown quite fond of my high-level consultant. I was wondering if he might be persuaded to accept a permanent position. No more ministry mandates, just us." The doubt that had plagued Draco for years, the fear that he was only a temporary fix for her loneliness, vanished in the depth of her gaze. He looked at her, and for the first time, he saw a future that wasn't a penance, but a reward. "I think I could be persuaded," he whispered. He reached for the box on the table and opened it. Inside was a key, not to her flat, but to a small cottage on the edge of the coast, a place they had discussed in the quiet hours of the 6th week. "I bought it yesterday. It needs work. The windows rattle and the garden is a jungle. I thought, perhaps we could fix it together." The approach was complete. The resolution of their story wasn't just about a healed bone. It was about the healing of two souls who had been broken by the same war in different ways. Hermione felt a surge of pure, unadulterated happiness, a light so bright it felt like a Patronus. "I'd love to fix it with you, Draco." He leaned in then, and this time the kiss was a celebration. It was long, deep, and tasted of 1,000 tomorrows. It was the kiss of a man who had finally found his way home, and a woman who had realized that sometimes the best things happen when your plans are forced to stop. They broke apart only when Crookshanks wound himself around their ankles, purring so loudly it vibrated through their shoes. Draco laughed, a sound that was now a frequent guest in the flat, and scooped the cat up, settling him on his shoulder. "Come on, Granger," Draco said, offering her his hand as the fire in the hearth burned a steady golden orange. "The ministry is waiting, and we have a lifetime of repairs to start on." As they stepped into the green flames together, the flat was left in a beautiful, expectant silence. The documents were gone, the cast was a memory, and the Dramione story had reached its final, perfect note. They emerged into the light of the ministry atrium, not as a hero and a villain, but as two people who had found the courage to be happy. The ending was clear, the resolution was absolute, and as they walked hand in hand toward the elevators, the world finally saw what they had known for weeks, that even the deepest fractures can knit back together, leaving something far more beautiful and resilient than what was there before. The transition from the sequestered warmth of the flat to the cavernous, echoing halls of the Ministry of Magic felt like stepping from a dream directly into a cold shower. Hermione stood at the edge of the atrium, the golden fountain gleaming with a polished, artificial light that felt aggressive after weeks of flickering candles and soft hearth fire. Her leg held firm, the bone knitted and strong, but her composure felt brittle. She wasn't alone. Draco stood beside her, his presence no longer the shadow of a reluctant consultant, but a solid, breathing reality. He wore a suit of charcoal wool, his shoulders squared, though Hermione could see the slight, telltale tension in the set of his jaw. He was waiting for the blow. He was waiting for the world to remind them that a hero and a villain were never meant to share the same air. "You don't have to do this," Draco murmured, his voice low enough to be drowned out by the rush of the flu network. "I can meet you at the office. There's no need to parade the liability through the atrium at peak hour." The cold of his self-doubt pricked at her heart. This was the first repulsion of the day, not from her, but from his own fear of ruining her. "I'm not parading anything," Hermione said, her voice ringing with a clarity that made a few passing wizards stop and stare. She reached out, sliding her hand into his, her fingers interlacing with his long, pale ones. "I am walking to work with my partner. If they have a problem with it, they can file a grievance with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. I hear they're very efficient." Draco's fingers tightened around hers, a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The warmth of his gratitude was palpable. For a moment, the atrium vanished, and it was just the two of them, anchored by a grip that refused to loosen. They began to walk. The reaction was instantaneous. The hum of conversation in the atrium didn't just dip, it died. It was replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence that followed them like a shroud. Hermione kept her chin up, her gaze fixed forward, but she felt the weight of 1,000 judgments. She saw Padma Patil freeze near the lifts, her mouth slightly open. She saw Cormac McLagan sneer, leaning over to whisper something to a colleague that made them both laugh. A jagged, ugly sound. By the time they reached the lifts, the doubt was starting to seep into the cracks of Hermione's resolve. Was she being selfish? Was she forcing Draco into a spotlight that would only burn him? The lift doors opened and they stepped inside, followed by a crush of ministry employees who suddenly found the floor tile patterns fascinating. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool and unspoken accusations. "Level 4, the cool, mechanical voice of the lift announced. As the crowd filtered out, a hand caught the door. It was Harry. He looked tired, his aura robe slightly singed at the hem, but his eyes were sharp behind his glasses. He looked at Hermione, then at their joined hands, and finally at Draco. The silence in the lift became a battlefield of trust and betrayal. Hermione felt Draco's hand twitch, a subconscious urge to pull away and protect her from the social fallout of being seen with him by the boy who lived. "Hermione," Harry said, his voice neutral. "Harry." Harry stepped into the lift, the doors sliding shut. He didn't look away from Draco. "I heard you were back today. I also heard the consultancy was extended." Draco stiffened, his porcelain mask sliding back into place. "The paperwork is complete, Potter. I was simply ensuring Granger reached her office without further injury." "Is that right?" Harry asked. He took a step closer, his presence commanding the small space. "Because I also heard that the garden gate at her flat was fixed, and the bookshelf, and that you've been seen buying muggle bread at 7 in the morning. Hermione's heart hammered. She waited for the lecture, for the warning, for the Ron won't like this speech. The cold of anticipation made her hands shake. But Harry didn't shout. He didn't reach for his wand. Slowly, he extended a hand toward Draco. "She looks better than she has in years," Harry said quietly. "If you're the reason for that, then I suppose the Ministry actually got something right for once." The warmth that flooded the lift was so intense, it felt like a Lumos Maxima. Draco looked at Harry's hand as if it were a portkey to a world he wasn't allowed to enter. Slowly, with a visible tremor, he shook it. "I intend to keep it that way," Draco said, his voice regaining its steel. "Good," Harry replied. He looked at Hermione and gave her a small, supportive nod before stepping out as the lift reached level 2. "See you for lunch, Hermione. Bring him if you want. We can talk about that consultancy over a sandwich." The doors closed again. Hermione leaned her head against Draco's shoulder, a shuddering breath escaping her. "That was more than I hoped for." "He's a better man than I am," Draco whispered, his face buried in her hair for a fleeting second. But as they reached her office on level 4, the final seesaw of the morning was waiting. The corridor was lined with her staff, junior researchers and clerks who looked up to her as a goddess of the wizarding world. As she approached with Draco Malfoy at her side, the smiles she expected were replaced by confusion and, in some cases, blatant repulsion. "Minister Granger," a young intern named Thomas stammered, his eyes darting to Draco. We have the morning briefings ready. We didn't realize you'd be accompanied." "Consultant Malfoy is here to finalize the transition of the Centaur Decree," Hermione said, her voice professional but icy. "He will be using the desk in my inner office for the morning. But, Mom, the security protocols have been cleared by the head of the Aura office," Hermione cut him off. "Unless you have a concern with Harry Potter's judgment, Thomas, I suggest you get to work." She led Draco into her office and slammed the door. The sound echoed with a satisfying finality. Draco dropped his satchel on the chair and walked to the window, looking out over the enchanted view of the London skyline. "They hate me, Hermione, and by extension, they're going to start hating you." "Let them," she said, crossing the room to stand behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek to the charcoal wool of his coat. "I've spent my whole life doing what was right for everyone else. For once, I'm doing what's right for me." Draco turned in her arms, his expression a mix of awe and agony. "I don't deserve you. I told you that in the flat, and I'll tell you every day until I'm grey." "And I'll tell you every day that you're wrong," she replied. She pulled him down for a kiss, a defiant, desperate kiss that tasted of the battle they were just beginning. It was a kiss that claimed him in the heart of the Ministry, a kiss that declared that the walls of the flat might be gone, but the foundation they had built was indestructible. The internal monologue that had once been filled with doubt was now silent. She didn't care about the whispers in the hallway or the sneers in the atrium. She looked at Draco, really looked at him, and saw the man who had cooked for her cat and fixed her floorboards. "We have a lot of work to do," she said, pulling back with a small smile. "The Centaur Decree?" he asked. "No, the world," she said. "But first, I think we should go to lunch with Harry. I want to see the look on the lunch lady's face when you order a tuna melt." Draco laughed, a bright, clear sound that pierced through the professional gloom of the office. The warmth was back, steady and true. The conflict of the day was won, and as they sat down at their respective desks, separated by only a few feet of mahogany, Hermione realized that the emotional seesaw had finally found its pivot. They weren't just surviving the world, they were going to change it. The morning ended with the sound of two quills scratching in unison, a harmony that the Ministry had never heard before, but would have to get used to. The story of the broken leg was over, but the story of the rest of their lives was only on the first page. The middle of the end was here, and for the first time, Hermione wasn't afraid of the ending. She was just looking forward to the next chapter. "Malfoy," she called out after a few minutes of silence. "Yes, Granger." "Thank you for staying." He looked up from his parchment, his silver eyes glowing with a quiet, fierce devotion. "I told you, I'm not going anywhere." The doors of the office remained closed, but the world outside felt a little less cold. The resolution was clear. They were a team. And as the afternoon sun began to climb higher in the enchanted sky, Hermione Granger finally felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. 10,000 characters of a new reality had begun, and as she reached for a fresh sheet of parchment, she knew that every word they wrote from now on would be written together. The Dramione era of the Ministry had officially begun, and it was going to be the most captivating story the wizarding world had ever seen. 11. The iron gates of Malfoy Manor did not creak. They swung open with a silent, oiled precision that felt more ominous than any rusted screech. Hermione stood at the edge of the gravel path, her fingers digging into the strap of her bag. The air here was different, colder, thinner, and tinged with the scent of ancient, stagnant power. Beside her, Draco was a statue of tension. He hadn't worn his ministry suit today. He was in black from throat to toe, a choice that made him look like a ghost returning to a haunt he had long tried to exorcise. The approach to this place was a physical weight, a repulsion that radiated from the very stones of the driveway. "We don't have to go inside," Draco said, his voice flat, his eyes fixed on the dark, looming silhouette of the house. "I can send an elf for the trunks. I can burn the rest. There is nothing in there that I need more than I need your peace of mind." Hermione looked at him, seeing the way his knuckles were white where he gripped his wand. The cold of the manor was trying to swallow him whole, trying to pull him back into the role of the broken prince. "You said you needed to close the door, Draco," she said, her voice steady despite the frantic fluttering in her chest. "We're closing it together. I won't let this house have power over you anymore, and I won't let it have power over me." The trust they had built in the small flat was being tested now in the shadows of a castle. Draco took a deep breath, reached out, and caught her hand. His palm was damp, his grip almost bruisingly tight. Together, they stepped across the threshold. The entrance hall was a cavern of marble and silence. Every footstep echoed like a heartbeat. For Hermione, the betrayal of her senses was immediate. She didn't see the tapestries or the portraits. She saw the drawing room floor. She felt the ghost of a knife at her throat. The repulsion was a scream in her marrow, a violent urge to turn and run until her lungs burst. Draco felt her flinch. He stopped immediately, turning to face her, his body shielding her from the view of the grand staircase. "Breathe, Hermione. Just breathe. Look at me. Only at me." She focused on his eyes, the silver grey that had become her North Star. The warmth of his gaze acted as a barrier against the freezing history of the room. "I'm okay," she whispered, though her voice was thin. "I'm here. I'm with you." They moved toward the library. Draco needed to retrieve the family grimoires and the personal journals that the ministry had finally cleared for his possession. As they walked through the corridors, the portraits watched. Some sneered, others looked away in shame. The doubt of the family legacy was etched into every gilded frame. In the library, the air was thick with the smell of old parchment and beeswax. Draco moved to a hidden panel behind a bust of Circe, tapping a sequence with his wand. "My father's journals are in here," he said, his voice echoing in the vast room. "And my mother's. I want them gone, Hermione. I want to take the knowledge that matters and leave the bitterness behind." He pulled out a series of heavy, leather-bound volumes. As he laid them on a table, a small, loose photograph fluttered out of one of the books. He picked it up, and his face went deathly pale. "What is it?" she asked, stepping closer. He didn't speak. He handed her the photo. It was a young Draco, perhaps 5 years old, sitting on the grass in the manor gardens. He was laughing, his face bright and untainted. Beside him, Narcissa was smiling with a genuine radiance Hermione had never seen on her face. The warmth of the image was a sharp contrast to the cold reality of the house. It was a reminder that even in this place, there had been a version of them that was capable of light. "I remember that day," Draco whispered. "It was before the marks, before the meetings. I thought the whole world was just this garden." He looked around the library, his expression hardening. "This house stole that from us. It turned a home into a fortress and then a prison. Then let's take the memories that are worth keeping and leave the prison to rot," Hermione said. They began to sort through the papers. It was a grueling, emotional archaeology. They found letters from Draco's childhood, blueprints for the manor's wards, and more painfully, the ledgers of the war. Every mention of a purity tax or a security measure was a fresh betrayal of the peace they were trying to build. The seesaw of the afternoon was relentless. One moment they were sharing a quiet, intimate discovery of a beautiful poem Draco had written as a boy. The next, they were staring at a list of confiscated Muggle artifacts that made Hermione's blood run cold. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody streaks of light across the library floor, Draco gathered the last of the journals. "I'm done," he said. "I have what I need." He led her back through the hall, but as they passed the drawing room, the doors were standing open. Hermione stopped. She couldn't help it. The room was dark, the furniture covered in white dust sheets that looked like ghosts. The repulsion hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her leg, though healed, felt a phantom ache. She remembered the cold of the floor, the smell of Bellatrix's perfume, the sound of her own voice pleading. Draco was beside her in a heartbeat. He didn't pull her away. He stepped into the room, his wand glowing with a soft blue light. "It's just a room, Hermione," he said, his voice fierce. "It's just wood and stone. It has no more magic than a broom closet unless we give it some. He walked to the center of the floor, the exact spot where the nightmare had happened. He looked at her, his hand extended. "Dance with me." "What?" she asked, her breath catching. "Draco, no. We should go." "No," he insisted. "I won't leave you with this memory as the last thing you feel in this house. Dance with me, right here. Let's change what this room means." The approach was the bravest thing she had ever seen. Hermione stepped into the room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She took his hand. He pulled her close, his arm wrapping around her waist, anchoring her. There was no music, only the sound of their breathing and the distant rustle of the wind in the trees outside. They moved in a slow, rhythmic circle. It wasn't a perfect dance. It was a stumble toward healing. With every step, the cold of the room seemed to recede. The warmth of Draco's body, the smell of his sandalwood cologne, the steady pressure of his hand. It was overwriting the past. He was reclaiming the space for her. He was turning a sight of torture into a sight of devotion. "I love you," he whispered into her ear. It was the first time he had said it without the shield of a metaphor or a joke. It was a raw, naked truth. Hermione closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and dampening the wool of his coat. "I love you too." The trust was absolute. The conflict of the manor, the struggle to exist within its history, was being resolved by the simple act of two people holding onto each other in the dark. They stayed that way for a long time, dancing in the ruins of a nightmare until the room felt small again. Just a room, just wood and stone. When they finally walked out the front doors, the sun had vanished, replaced by a deep velvet blue. Draco stopped at the edge of the gravel and looked back one last time. He raised his wand. "No," Hermione said, touching his arm. "Don't burn it. That's too easy. Let it sit here in the dark. We don't need the fire to be free of it." Draco lowered his wand, a slow, weary smile touching his lips. "You're right. It's not worth the sparks." They turned their backs on Malfoy Manor and began the walk back to the gates. The air felt warmer now, the cold of the estate unable to follow them past the iron boundaries. "Where to now?" Draco asked as they reached the road. "Home," she said. "The real one, the one with the rattling windows and the messy garden." "The cottage," he said, his voice brightening. "I've already started the charms on the kitchen. I think we can have the first room finished by Tuesday." The warmth of the future was a golden light ahead of them. The emotional seesaw had finally stilled into a quiet, enduring peace. They had survived the ghosts of the past, and as they disappeared into the night, the only thing left of Malfoy Manor was the silence of a house that no longer had a story to tell. Hermione leaned her head on his shoulder as they walked, her legs strong, her heart light. The conflict of their history was resolved. The transition from the flat to the world was complete. They were no longer a hero and a villain. They were just two people going home to a house they were going to fix together, one brick and one memory at a time. The 11th chapter was closing, and as the stars began to poke through the clouds, Hermione Granger realized that the most beautiful part of a story isn't the climax. It's the quiet, steady breath you take when you realize you're finally, truly safe. "I'm glad we went," she whispered. "I'm glad we're leaving," he replied. And as the gates of the manor vanished behind them, The only thing that mattered was the warmth of his hand in hers and the long, beautiful road ahead. 12. The sound of the sea was the first thing Hermione learned to love about their new life. It wasn't the aggressive, crashing roar of a storm, but a constant, rhythmic pulse, a salt-tinged lullaby that reminded her that the world was vast and indifferent to the petty squabbles of the ministry. It was a grounding force. The cottage sat on a jagged cliff in Cornwall, its whitewashed stones weathered by decades of spray and wind. It was a far cry from the cramped London flat, and light years away from the oppressive grandeur of Malfoy Manor. It was imperfect. The windows rattled in their frames like chattering teeth. The garden was a riotous jungle of sea thrift and overgrown gorse, and the front door had a stubborn habit of sticking whenever the humidity rose. But to Hermione, it was a masterpiece. She stood on the wooden deck Draco had finished building only 2 days prior, holding a steaming mug of tea. Her leg felt vibrant and strong. She could even manage the steep path down to the beach now without so much as a twinge. The physical healing was complete, but as she watched the sun begin its slow, golden descent toward the horizon, she felt the final tremors of the emotional seesaw that had defined her last few months. The approach of their new life was terrifying in its stillness. Without a mission, without a recovery, and without the scandal of the ministry to fight against, they were left with the most daunting task of all, simply being happy. The kettle is screaming, Granger. I assume you're ignoring it to contemplate the existential nature of the tide. Draco stepped out onto the deck, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hair wind-blown. He was covered in a light dusting of white powder, plaster from the guest room ceiling he was currently convincing to stay aloft. The warmth in his voice was a steady, low hum that made her heart ache with a sweetness she still wasn't entirely used to. I was thinking about the first day, she said, turning to him, when you brought the salmon and told me my flat was a fire hazard. Draco leaned against the railing beside her, his silver eyes catching the amber light of the sunset. It was a fire hazard, and the salmon was excellent. Don't try to revise history just because we've moved to the coast. He reached out, his hand finding hers on the railing. The trust between them was no longer a fragile bridge. It was the foundation of the house behind them. But even now, in the quiet, a flicker of doubt could still spark. Do you ever miss it? She asked softly. The manor, the certainty of who you were supposed to be, even if it was terrible. Draco's grip on her hand tightened for a brief second before relaxing. The cold of the question hung in the air. He looked out at the water, his expression pensive. I miss the version of my mother that lived there before the war, he admitted, his voice a ghost of a whisper. But the rest? No. Being Draco Malfoy in that house was like wearing a suit of armor that was 3 sizes too small. It kept me upright, but I couldn't breathe. Here. He paused, looking at his plaster-stained hands. Here. I'm just the man who can't quite get the kitchen tiles level. It's a much better fit. The repulsion of his past was finally being replaced by the acceptance of his present. He turned to her, pulling her into the circle of his arms. And you? Do you miss being the golden girl who everyone needed to save? I never liked being saved, she reminded him, leaning her head against his shoulder. But I found I quite liked being cared for. There's a difference. The conflict of their roles, The hero and the redeemed was finally dissolving into the simple reality of a partnership. They weren't characters in a war story anymore. They were just two people building a home. "I have something for you," Draco said suddenly, stepping back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, delicate object. It was a bracelet, but not of gold or silver. It was made of a dark, polished wood, inlaid with a tiny, shimmering piece of iridescent seashell. "I found the wood in the debris of your old bookshelf," he explained, looking unusually sheepish. "The one that fell. I kept a piece, and the shell is from our beach. I thought, a reminder that things can break and still be used to make something beautiful." The warmth that flooded Hermione was so intense, it brought tears to her eyes. The approach of his love was so deliberate, so careful. She held out her wrist, and he fastened the clasp with steady fingers. "It's perfect," she whispered. "It's a bit naive folk art, isn't it?" he teased, echoing her own artistic preferences from months ago. "Very Maria Primachenko of me." She laughed, a bright, clear sound that carried on the salt wind. "It's exactly what I wanted." As the sky turned a deep, bruised purple and the first stars began to pierce the veil, the final seesaw of the story settled into a perfect balance. There was no more betrayal to fear, no more cold to endure. The transition was complete. The door to the cottage was open, spilling a warm yellow light onto the deck. From inside, the indignant yowl of Crookshanks signaled that dinner was late. "We should go in," Hermione said, though she didn't move. "In a minute," Draco replied. He turned her in his arms, his gaze dropping to her lips. The slow burn had reached its final enduring glow. He leaned down, his kiss tasting of the sea and the promise of 1,000 unremarkable, wonderful nights. It was a kiss of arrival. They eventually retreated inside, the stubborn front door clicking shut behind them. Draco set to work on the stove, humming that same low, unrecognizable tune he'd hummed in her London flat, while Hermione sat at the kitchen table, opening a new book. But this time she wasn't reading to escape. She wasn't reading because she was trapped. She was reading because she was at peace. "Malfoy," she called out over the sizzle of the pan. "Yes, Granger. The roof really isn't leaking." He looked over his shoulder, a devastatingly handsome smirk playing on his lips. "Give it time, Hermione. It's an old house. I'm sure I'll find something else to fix soon enough." "I count on it," she said, her heart full. The story of the girl who broke her leg had ended a long time ago. This was the story of the woman who chose to stay and the man who learned how to build. As the fire roared in the hearth and the Cornish wind rattled the glass, the two of them sat in the warmth of their own making, finally, truly home. The resolution was absolute. The development was complete. The emotional seesaw had found its center, and it was a place of quiet, enduring love. The final chapter of their isolation had closed, and the infinite book of their life together had just begun its most beautiful passage.
История 19. Гермиона зламала ногу. Thank you for staying with me until the end. This story was not just about a broken leg, it was about how we see people. Sometimes we think we know someone, we see their past, we see their mistakes, we build walls to stay safe, but then life forces us to stop. Hermione had to stop. Draco had to say. In that silence, They finally really looked at each other. I believe that even the deepest wounds can heal, not with magic, but with time, tea, and someone who stays when things get hard. Love is not always a lightning bolt. Sometimes it is a fixed thing. Sometimes it is a warm meal. In this, тут склейка. Sometimes it is a warm meal. It is the person who picks up the paper you dropped. I hope this story gave you a little bit of warmth today. Remember, it is never too late to change your mind about someone. And it is never too late to let someone in. Thank you for listening. This story was written especially for you. See you in the next one.